The Black Hawk hit the roof of Cascade Ridge Medical Center so hard the whole building shook. Rain was coming sideways, lightning splitting the sky, and 4 military medics were already sprinting through the stairwell doors before the rotors stopped turning. They had a man on a litter, pale, bleeding through every bandage they'd layered on him, vitals dropping by the minute. The ER team met them at the elevator. Doctors shouted orders. Monitors screamed. And then the man on the stretcher, barely conscious, one eye swollen shut, hand slick with his own blood, reached out and grabbed the nearest doctor's wrist so hard the physician gasped. "Whitaker," the soldier rasped. "Get me Nora Whitaker." The hallway went dead quiet. Nora was standing 12 feet away, holding a clipboard, wearing scrubs with a coffee stain on the sleeve. 31 years old, second shift trauma nurse, the woman her coworkers called the workhorse when they were being polite, and the ghost when they weren't. She hadn't moved. She was staring at the man on the stretcher the same way everyone else was staring at her. Like something had just cracked open in the middle of the room and nobody could explain what had fallen out. She had never seen this man before in her life. The military officers standing at the edge of the group, 2 of them, dress uniforms soaked through, expressions carved from stone, looked at Nora's face and went very, very still. If you're watching this right now, stay with me until the end. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm had been moving up the coast since afternoon, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that turned Harbor Crest, Oregon, into a gray blur for days at a time. Cascade Ridge Medical Center sat on a hillside above the city, a regional trauma facility that handled everything from logging accidents to cardiac emergencies, and on a night like this, the ER was already packed before the helicopter ever appeared on radar. Nora had been on since 3. She'd triaged a construction worker with a punctured lung, talked a panicking mother through her son's febrile seizure, and spent 40 minutes on paperwork that should have taken 10 because the system kept freezing. Her shoulders ached. She hadn't eaten since noon. When the trauma alert fired at 8:47 p.m., military transport inbound, single critical, ETA 4 minutes. She'd felt the familiar cold focus slide into place behind her eyes. The thing that happened when the noise dropped away and the work became everything. She wasn't supposed to be the lead on incoming trauma that night. That was Dr. Marcus Holt's rotation, and Marcus had a habit of making sure everyone knew it. He was already positioning himself at the elevator when the stretcher came through, shoulders squared, voice carrying. Single GSW to the torso, exit wound present, tension pneumo suspected, one of the military medics called out. Lost pressure twice in the air. He's been holding on 2 liters of saline. "Get me a chest tray," Holt said. "Somebody call cardio on call." Nora moved to the left side of the stretcher automatically, checking the IV line, cataloging what she saw. The bandaging on the man's chest was military grade, applied correctly, tight, layered, but the skin around it was the wrong color. There was something else too, something in the way he was breathing, a subtle labor at the end of each exhale that she registered without quite naming yet. She filed it. Then the man opened his eye and found her face. "Whitaker." His voice was barely there. "Nora Whitaker." She leaned in. "I'm here. I've got you." His hand found her wrist, grip surprisingly strong for someone bleeding this much. "Don't let them pull you off this." She didn't know what that meant. She told him to save his energy. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos. Holt ran the trauma bay with his usual authority, issuing orders, correcting residents, keeping the team focused. Nora worked the room the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, 2 steps ahead, anticipating what was needed before it was asked for. She rechecked the chest tube placement when the drainage numbers didn't line up. She flagged a discrepancy in the second set of vitals to the resident standing next to her, a young woman named Priya, who actually listened when Nora spoke. "His pressure's responding but not holding," Nora said, watching the monitor. "It shouldn't still be swinging this much." Priya frowned. "You think there's something else?" "I think we haven't found it yet." Holt heard that. He turned from the supply cart with a particular expression Nora had learned to recognize over the past 2 years. Not quite irritation, more like the look someone gives a background noise they've decided to tolerate. "Whitaker." He said her last name the way people say anyway in the middle of a sentence. We're following the protocol. I know. I'm just flagging the pressure pattern. I can read a monitor. She didn't say anything else. She went back to the IV line. The two military officers had followed the stretcher as far as the trauma bay doors and stopped there, which was standard. What wasn't standard was the way they stayed. Most military escorts paced or made calls or asked staff questions. These two stood perfectly still, watching through the window, and every few minutes the taller one would say something quiet to the other, and they'd both look at Nora. She noticed. She didn't let it change what her hands were doing. The soldier's name wasn't in the intake paperwork. That happened sometimes with military cases. Classification protocols, operational security, whatever the chain of command decided was appropriate. The admitting clerk had a form with a case number and a unit designation she didn't recognize, and that was it. Nora had dealt with this before, years ago, before Cascade Ridge, before Harbor Crest. She knew the language. She knew what the absence of a name meant about the kind of work this man did. She set that aside. It wasn't relevant to keeping him alive. What was relevant? By 10 p.m., his pressure had stabilized enough to move him to the surgical ICU for monitoring. Holt signed off on the transfer, gave the night team their handoff, and went to write his notes. Nora completed her documentation, checked in on two of her other patients, and then walked to the ICU to make sure the transition had gone clean. She was standing at the nurse's station when she heard the voice behind her. You shouldn't be up here. She turned. Diane Mercer was leaning against the wall near the elevator bank, arms crossed, wearing the expression she'd been perfecting for 2 years, something between administrative concern and personal satisfaction, like she'd been waiting to say this specific sentence for a while. Diane was the charge nurse for the surgical floor, 50s, 23 years at Cascade Ridge, the kind of institutional fixture whose tenure had calcified into authority. She wasn't Nora's direct supervisor, but she had the ear of people who were, and she used it constantly. I'm doing a follow-up on my transfer, Nora said. Standard. That patient was handed off. He's not your responsibility. I was the primary on the floor for the first hour. I want to make sure the transition notes were complete. The transition notes were completed by Dr. Holt's team. Diane pushed off the wall, took 2 steps closer. She kept her voice low, which was somehow worse than if she'd been loud. And I've had 2 nurses come to me tonight saying you were involving yourself in decisions above your scope. Again. Nora kept her expression level. I flagged a vital sign discrepancy to a resident. That's within my scope. That's not the way it was described to me. Then it was described inaccurately. Diane's chin came up a little. You've been here 2 years, Nora. 2 years, and you still haven't figured out how this place works. You are a nurse. A good one, maybe, but you overstep. You make physicians uncomfortable. You create friction in situations where everyone needs to be moving in the same direction. She paused, letting that settle. I've already spoken to Director Callahan. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow morning about tonight's incident. What incident? Your conduct in the trauma bay. Nora felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly. Something more like recognition. The specific, exhausting feeling of watching a process you've seen before begin to move. I'll be at the meeting, she said. Diane nodded, like this was exactly the right answer, and walked to the elevator. Nora stood at the nurse's station for a moment. The ICU hummed around her. Through the window of the room at the end of the hall, she could see monitors tracking the soldier's vitals. Still irregular, still not quite right. She watched the line on the screen flatten and rise. Flatten and rise. Something about the pattern nagged at her. She couldn't name it. Not yet. She went back downstairs. But Cascade Ridge had a particular social ecology that Nora had spent 2 years observing without entirely understanding. It wasn't that the staff were cruel, exactly. Most of them were decent, overworked people trying to do difficult jobs. But there were currents, alignments, a whole invisible architecture of who mattered to whom and why. Diane Mercer sat at the center of one of those currents, and she had, for reasons Nora had never fully decoded, decided early that Nora was a problem to be managed. It had started small. Comments about Nora's documentation style in morning meetings, Questions raised about her bedside manner with the difficult patient, questions that turned out to be unsubstantiated but that still produced a file notation. A rumor, traced back to nothing, that Nora had been let go from her previous position under unclear circumstances. Untrue, but persistent, the kind of thing that changed the way people looked at you in the break room. Nora's previous position had been in the military. She'd left that part of her life behind deliberately, cleanly, not because she was ashamed of it, but because the person she'd been then felt like someone she'd set down carefully and chosen not to pick back up. She was a civilian nurse now. That was enough. The problem was that it also meant she had no reference here, no network, no colleague who'd known her for a decade and would say, "That's not who Nora is," when Diane implied otherwise. She'd arrived at Cascade Ridge the way people arrive at new cities, but carrying the whole weight of everything she knew and having to prove it from scratch. Most days she could absorb the friction and keep working. Some days it was harder. She was in the break room at 11:30, eating a granola bar she'd found in her locker, when Priya appeared in the doorway looking uncertain. "Hey." Priya came in, let the door close behind her. She was second-year resident, sharp, the kind of doctor who would be excellent in 5 years and was already better than she knew. "You doing okay?" "Fine." "Mercer's been talking to people. I wanted you to know." Priya sat down across from her. "She's saying you were directing the trauma response, calling orders, undermining Holt." "That's not what happened." "I know, I was there." Priya hesitated. "But I'm a resident. My weight in this kind of conversation is—" She made a small gesture. "I know," Nora said. "Thank you for telling me. Is there anything—" "Go get some sleep. You've got rounds at 6. Priya looked like she wanted to say more. She left instead, which was the right call. Nora finished the granola bar and stared at the wall. The thing about Diane Mercer was that she was strategic. She didn't make accusations that were obviously false. She raised concerns. She expressed worries. She framed everything in the language of institutional care. "I'm just trying to make sure our patients are getting the right level of oversight. I want to make sure everyone understands the chain of responsibility." It was impossible to argue with, the way fog was impossible to punch. You couldn't defend against concern. You could only keep doing your job well and hope that eventually it would speak for itself. 2 years in, Nora wasn't sure that was working. She put the wrapper in the trash, refilled her water bottle, and went back to the floor. At 1:15 a.m., the ICU called a rapid response. Nora heard it through the intercom in the hallway. Unit 4, Room 12, the end of the hall, the room she'd been watching through the window 2 hours earlier. She was moving before the announcement finished. She wasn't on the ICU team. She knew that. She went anyway. The room was crowded by the time she arrived. The night resident, 2 ICU nurses, a respiratory tech. The soldier's vitals on the monitor were falling apart, pressure dropping, heart rate irregular, oxygen saturation sliding south. The night resident, a third-year named Gaines who was competent but rattled, was issuing orders with the slightly elevated pitch of someone who wasn't sure they were the right orders. "Push another liter. He's already fluid heavy," Nora said from the doorway. Gaines looked up. "Whitaker? This isn't your unit." "I know." She stepped in anyway, looked at the monitor, looked at the patient. The breathing pattern was there again, the thing she'd been trying to name for 3 hours. "When did the fever start?" One of the ICU nurses checked the chart. "Temp spiked at midnight. We were watching it." Nora looked at the skin around the chest wound site. There was a faint mottling she hadn't been able to see clearly in the chaos of the trauma bay. Not much, but there. She thought about the entry and exit wounds, the way they'd been positioned, the mechanism. She thought about things she'd seen in other contexts, in other places, that she'd been very deliberately not thinking about since this man arrived. "This isn't a standard GSW complication," she said. His wound pattern, the fever presentation, the way his pressure responds and then slides back. There's a specific gram-negative infection that presents this way. Field-acquired environmental exposure. Sometimes shows up in combat zone injuries with this kind of debris contamination. Standard broad spectrum isn't going to touch it. Gaines stared at her. "How would you know that?" She didn't answer that question. You need to adjust the antibiotic protocol and page the attending now. If I'm right, you have maybe 40 minutes before this gets significantly worse. And if you're wrong, then you waste 40 minutes and a slightly different antibiotic. There was a long beat. Gaines looked at the monitor, looked at Nora, looked at the monitor again. "Page Dr. Vasquez," he said to the nearest nurse. "Tell her we need her here." Nora stayed at the edge of the room while they worked. She didn't give any more direction. She'd said what she needed to say. The rest was theirs. She watched the monitor. She was still watching it when Diane Mercer walked in. Diane took in the scene with the particular stillness of someone building a case in real time. She looked at Nora. She looked at Gaines. She looked at the chart one of the nurses had left open on the counter. "What are you doing up here, Nora?" Responding to a rapid response. "You're not on this unit." "I heard the call." Diane's jaw tightened. "You need to leave right now." "The attending isn't here yet. I am telling you to leave." Diane's voice had dropped to something flat and final. "You are in a room you have no authorization to be in, involving yourself in a case you were separated from hours ago, after I specifically told you that Director Callahan has been notified about your conduct. If you do not leave this room in the next 30 seconds, I will call security." Nora looked at the monitor. The soldier's pressure was 78/50 and falling. 30 seconds, Diane said. Nora looked at the door. She looked at Gaines, who was on the phone, voice low, probably reaching Vasquez. She looked at the ICU nurse who'd been working this room all night, a woman named Rosaria, who Nora barely knew, who was watching her with an expression that wasn't hostile, just exhausted and uncertain. She left the room. She stood in the hallway outside and listened to the sounds from inside. The monitor alarm, the voices adjusting, the particular controlled urgency of a team working a deteriorating patient. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The two military officers were at the end of the hallway. She hadn't seen them come up. They were standing near the stairwell door, the taller one and a shorter one who she now recognized wore a different insignia. Higher rank, older face, the kind of stillness that came from years of managing crisis without showing it. They were both looking at her. The taller one stepped forward. "Nurse Whitaker." She pushed off the wall. "I'm sorry, this floor is restricted to, I know." He stopped about 6 feet from her. "I'm Colonel Dale Forsyth. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He paused. "Do you know who that man is?" "No," she said. "His intake form has a case number, no name." Forsyth watched her for a long moment. He was trying to read something in her face, she could tell. Something specific, like he was looking for a reaction that should have been there. "Nora Whitaker," he said, slower this time, almost careful. 3 years ago, before this position, she felt something shift in the back of her chest. "I left the military. That's not a secret. Where did you serve?" "I'm not going to discuss my service record with Kandahar Province," he said. "Forward operating base, classified position, winter of 2021. He stopped. "Does that mean anything to you?" She didn't answer. Her heart was doing something she didn't like. Forsyth looked at the door of room 12. Then he looked back at her, and whatever he'd been looking for in her face, he seemed to find it, or find the absence of it, which was apparently enough. "His name is Ethan Cross," Forsyth said quietly. "He's a commander in a special operations unit I'm not going to name in this hallway. And 3 years ago, Nora, during a mission that went very badly wrong." He stopped. "He's been looking for you." The monitor alarm from inside the room changed pitch. Gaines's voice rose behind the door, and Nora was already moving back toward room 12 before she made the conscious decision to do it. Diane Mercer and Director Callahan, and every threat that had been made to her tonight dissolving into something entirely irrelevant against the single fact that a man was dying in that room, and she knew something nobody else in this building knew. She pushed the door open. "He has Burkholderia pseudomalae exposure," she said. "Environmental contamination from standing water, probably 48 to 72 hours pre-injury. It's riding the wound site. You need meropenem and ceftazidime. Dual therapy, right now. Not broad spectrum, this specific combination." Gaines stared at her over the patient's body. "That's a tropical pathogen," he said. "That's melioidosis. That doesn't present here. It doesn't present here normally. He wasn't injured here. She moved to the monitor, to the chart, to the specific readout she needed. This is the third time his pressure has bottomed, and the third time the standard treatment has bought him an hour and nothing more. You've been treating a GSW complication. This is a secondary infection that is going to kill him in the next 30 minutes if you keep doing that. Rosario was already looking at Gaines. Gaines was looking at the chart. I need Vasquez on the phone, not on her way in. I need her now, he said. Then he looked at Nora. If you're wrong, I know. He picked up the phone. Behind Nora, the door opened. She knew without turning that it was Diane. She could feel the specific quality of the silence that entered the room with her. Nurse Whitaker. Diane's voice was absolutely controlled. I told you to leave this floor. Give her a minute, Rosario said quietly. Diane looked at Rosario like she'd never heard her speak before. The phone crackled. Gaines had Vasquez. He was reading off numbers, reciting what Nora had said, his voice carrying the particular force neutrality of someone who wasn't sure they were right, but had decided to go anyway. There was a pause. Vasquez said something. Gaines said yes. Another pause. She wants to know who made the call. Gaines looked at Nora. The monitor was still alarming. Outside in the hallway, Colonel Forsyth stood beside the door and said nothing and waited, and the hospital moved around him the way water moves around a stone, and in the room behind him a man named Ethan Cross was balanced on the exact narrow edge between what could be fixed and what couldn't. Nora put her hand on the bed rail and looked at the monitor and didn't look at Diane. Tell her it was the nurse, she said. Vasquez came back on the line inside 30 seconds. Gaines listened, nodded twice, then looked at the nearest ICU nurse. Get me meropenem and ceftazidime. Dual therapy. We're starting now. He was already recalculating the dosage, scribbling on the back of the chart. And I need a new blood culture sent stat. Different lab than the last one. Flag it urgent. Rosario was already moving. Diane hadn't moved at all. She was standing just inside the door, and the particular stillness she wore now was different from her usual administrative composure. This was the stillness of someone recalculating, which was almost worse. She watched Gaines work. She watched Rosaria pull the medication from the override cabinet. She watched Nora standing at the bed rail with her hand resting lightly on the rail's edge and her eyes on the monitor, not on anyone in the room, not performing anything. This isn't over, Diane said. Nobody answered her. Not because they were dismissing her. They were just working. She left. Nora exhaled slowly through her nose. The next 20 minutes were the grinding, unglamorous kind of medicine. Fluids recalibrated, the new antibiotics running, Gaines on the phone twice more with Vasquez, who was now in her car and driving in, vitals still unstable, but the specific quality of the instability beginning to shift. There was a moment around 1:50 a.m. where the oxygen saturation dipped to 88, and everyone in the room got very quiet and very focused. And then it came back up to 93, and Gaines made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite relief, but was pointed in that direction. Nora stayed through all of it. Nobody told her to leave again. At 2:20, the soldier's pressure settled at 94/60 and held there. Not good, not anywhere near good, but holding. Gaines leaned against the counter and looked at her. He had the look of someone who'd just run a long distance and hadn't decided yet how he felt about reaching the end. You want to tell me how a trauma nurse knows the specific antibiotic protocol for a tropical disease presentation in a combat wound context? Not particularly, Nora said. He looked at her for another moment. Fair enough. He capped his pen. Thank you. She nodded and walked out. Colonel Forsyth was still in the hallway, which somehow didn't surprise her. The shorter officer, she still didn't have his name, had gone somewhere, but Forsyth was standing in exactly the same spot, hands clasped behind his back, like he'd been prepared to wait considerably longer than 20 minutes. He's holding, she said before he could ask. I know, Rosaria told me. He fell into step beside her as she moved toward the nurse's station, which she hadn't invited but also didn't object to. Dr. Vasquez is 5 minutes out. She confirmed your assessment. Good. Nora. He said her first name like a door he was deciding whether to open. What I told you in the hallway, about who he is, what he said when they pulled him, I heard you. And? She stopped at the station and turned to face him. "And I don't know what you want me to say to that. I've been out of the service for 3 years. I don't know how he knew my name, I don't know why he asked for me, and right now I'm more focused on the fact that someone just tried to have me removed from the floor while a patient was crashing." She held his gaze. "So whatever the rest of this is, the history, the explanation, it's going to have to wait until that man is not actively dying." Forsyth considered that. Reasonable. "Good night, Colonel." "There's a meeting at 700, he said to her back. "Director Callahan's office. I'll be there." She kept walking. Sansant. She didn't sleep. There was no point trying. Her shift ended at 7 a.m. and the meeting was at 7. And even if she'd had a window, she was too wired to use it. She spent the hours between 3 and 6 doing the things she did when she needed to be somewhere other than inside her own head. Checked on her other patients, updated her notes, drank 2 cups of bad coffee from the break room, sat for 15 minutes in a supply closet that nobody used, and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. Kandahar. He'd said Kandahar. She hadn't thought about that word in a long time. She'd been careful not to. There was a specific kind of discipline required to set down the weight of certain things, and she'd developed it the way you develop any skill. Through repetition, through refusal, through choosing the next thing in front of you over the thing behind. It had worked, mostly. Cascade Ridge and its rhythms and even its politics had become real to her in a way that meant something. This was her life. She'd built it deliberately. And now a man she didn't recognize had said her name from a stretcher, and a colonel was waiting in the hallway, and in 9 hours, everything that she'd set down carefully was asking to be picked back up. She went back to the floor. At 6:30, Priya found her in the medication room. The resident looked like she'd slept for maybe 2 hours on a couch somewhere and was running on spite and caffeine, which was a look Nora recognized. "Mercer filed a formal complaint," Priya said without preamble, "last night, against you. I heard it from the night charge before she went home." She hesitated, then, "She's saying you inserted yourself into the ICU without authorization, gave orders above your scope, created a liability situation. She wants you suspended pending review." Nora set down the medication cart she'd been checking. "How many people know about the antibiotic call?" "Word travels." Priya glanced toward the hallway. "Gaines told Vasquez when she arrived. Vasquez told someone from the surgical team. You know how this building works." She lowered her voice. "The patient stabilized, Nora. Everyone on that floor knows why." "It doesn't matter if everyone knows why if Diane frames it the right way." Priya's jaw tightened. That's how it works here. You know that." Nora didn't say it bitterly. She said it the way she'd say the sky is overcast, like a weather observation, like a fact about the terrain. "Is Callahan in yet?" "Came in an hour ago. His assistant sent a reminder about the 0700 meeting." Priya paused. "Are you going to be okay? Go do your rounds." "That's not what I asked." Nora looked at her. Priya was 28 probably, and still in the phase of her career where she believed that doing excellent work was sufficient protection against institutional machinery. Nora remembered that phase. "I'll be fine," she said, and tried to mean it. She got there at 6:58. Callahan's office was on the administrative floor, and it had the particular atmosphere of rooms where decisions about other people's lives were made. Neutral carpet, framed credentials, a desk large enough to establish hierarchy without being ostentatious about it. Director Paul Callahan was in his mid-50s, a healthcare administrator who'd come up through finance rather than clinical work, and who ran Cascade Ridge with the specific sensibility of someone managing a balance sheet that occasionally contained human beings. He was not, in Nora's experience, a bad man. He was a cautious one, which in practice often produced similar outcomes. Diane was already there, seated to the left, with a manila folder on her lap that Nora clocked immediately. Dr. Holt was there too, which she hadn't anticipated. Seated across from Diane, arms crossed, expressions suggesting he'd been pulled from something he considered more important. What she hadn't anticipated was Colonel Forsyth. He was standing near the window in his dress uniform. The other officer, who she now saw wore the insignia of a JAG lieutenant colonel, beside him. 2 military lawyers or liaisons in a hospital director's office at 7 in the morning was not a configuration Nora had ever encountered, and from the look on Callahan's face, neither had he. There was a specific quality to Callahan's composure, managed but strained, like a bridge that was holding but aware of the weight. "Miss Whitaker," Callahan gestured to a chair. "Please sit down." She sat. She put her hands in her lap and kept them still. "I think we all know why we're here," Callahan began. "Last night's events raised some—" "Before we get into that," Forsyth said, not rudely, but with the absolute authority of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had no patience for the ambient warm-up, "I need to establish something for the record." He looked at Callahan. "The patient who arrived at this facility last night via military transport is under federal protection protocols. His identity, the circumstances of his injury, and any details pertaining to his service record are classified at a level that supersedes this institution's internal processes." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not here to interfere with your HR procedures, but I am here to make sure that any decisions made in this room today are made with full awareness of the federal dimensions of this case." Callahan looked at him. Then he looked at Diane. Then he looked at his desk. "I appreciate that, Colonel," he said carefully. "But the matters we're addressing this morning are internal clinical conduct concerns that— The conduct concern involves the nurse who identified a potentially fatal secondary infection that your attending physician and on-call resident both missed." Forsyth's voice didn't change temperature. "That's the conduct you're reviewing." Holt shifted in his chair. "That's a significant oversimplification of what— Dr. Holt," the JAG officer spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Forsyth's, but landed with equal weight. "I'd encourage you to choose your next words carefully, given that we will be reviewing the full clinical record of last night's events." The room went quiet enough that the HVAC was audible. Diane opened her folder. "I want to be clear that my concern isn't with the outcome for the patient. The outcome was positive, and we're all glad for that. My concern is with the process. Nurse Whitaker was not on the ICU rotation. She had been specifically informed that her involvement with this case was creating liability concerns. She ignored direct instructions from a senior staff member. She saved the patient's life," Forsyth said. "She violated protocol. The protocol was failing the patient." "Colonel," Callahan put his hand up, a peace gesture that both parties technically honored while actually ignoring. "I understand the sensitivities here. I want to make sure we're hearing everyone. Nora—" He turned to her, and there was something in his voice that she recognized as an attempt at fairness, even if the attempt was going to be insufficient. "Can you walk me through your decision-making last night?" She had thought about this on the way up in the elevator. She'd known what she was walking into, and she'd decided how to handle it. Clean, precise, no defensiveness. At approximately 1:15 a.m., I heard the rapid response call for Unit 4, Room 12. I responded because I had prior knowledge of this patient's presentation that I believed was relevant to his deteriorating condition. I identified a secondary infection pattern consistent with environmental pathogen exposure and communicated my assessment to the on-call resident, who contacted the attending, who authorized the modified treatment protocol. The patient stabilized following implementation of that protocol. That's the full sequence. "You were told to leave the floor," Diane said. "I was. I made a judgment call." "That's not your judgment to make." "Someone was going to die if I didn't." The words landed flat and direct, the way she'd intended. Not emotional, not dramatic, just the precise weight of the fact. Callahan looked at his desk again. "Here's what I think we should do," he said. "We table any formal disciplinary action pending a full clinical review." "Diane, I hear your concerns about protocol and I take them seriously. Colonel, I take your point about the circumstances of last night. Nora," he looked at her. "You're on administrative leave while the review is conducted. That's standard procedure when a formal concern has been filed." Nora looked at him. "How long?" "A week, maybe 2. And in that time, I'm not on the floor." "That's correct." She heard Diane shift slightly in her chair. There was no sound to it, not really. Just the awareness of someone settling, the quiet satisfaction of weight coming to rest where they'd wanted it. "Understood," Nora said. She stood because there was nothing left to say, and she knew when a room had made its decision. Forsyth was watching her. She didn't look at him. She walked out. "Brad," The air outside the hospital was cold and wet, the tail end of the storm still hanging over Harbor Crest in a low gray ceiling. Nora sat in her car in the parking garage for a while, not thinking exactly, more like the interior quiet that happened when the processing was done, and the next move hadn't arrived yet. Administrative leave, 2 years of careful, unglamorized work, and a patient had lived because of what she knew, and she was going home while Diane Mercer sat in that building and filed papers. She drove back to her apartment, which was small and orderly and overlooked a parking lot. She made coffee she didn't particularly want. She stood at the window. Her phone rang at 9. It was a number she didn't know. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 9:15. Same number. She picked up. Whitaker. This is Lieutenant Colonel Adele Ferris, the JAG officer from the meeting up, the quieter one. I apologize for the early contact. Do you have a few minutes? I have nothing but time right now. A short pause. Not uncomfortable, more like someone deciding how to begin. I want to be direct with you. What happened in that meeting this morning was not the end of this. The formal clinical review is going to be very short because the documentation will show that your intervention was not only within reasonable clinical judgment, but was specifically the difference between the patient living or not. Dr. Vasquez's preliminary notes make that unambiguous. Another pause. But that's the smaller piece. Okay? Commander Cross regained full consciousness this morning at 08:30. He's been asking for you since 8:35. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the counter. Why? He'd like to tell you that himself, but I can tell you that Colonel Forsyth's presence at that meeting this morning was not incidental, and the interest this command has in your current employment situation goes beyond a routine patient welfare concern. Ferris let that breathe. We'd like to come to you, if that's acceptable, sometime today. Nora looked at the parking lot below her window. There was a woman down there loading groceries into a minivan, unhurried, a toddler buckled into the cart. An ordinary morning, the kind she'd assembled deliberately. Okay, she said. We'll be there at 11. She put the phone down. She thought about what Forsyth had said in the hallway. He's been looking for you. Ethan Cross was a name she didn't recognize, which meant either he'd operated under a different name in the context she was being pointed toward, or, more likely, she'd been in the same place as someone she'd never been formally introduced to, which happened in that world more often than civilians understood. You knew people by call sign, by function, by the fact that they were the person to your left when things went sideways. You didn't always know their names. Kandahar, 2021. She pressed her palms flat on the counter and made herself stop going there until she had more information. Forsyth and Ferris arrived at 10:53, which meant they'd been sitting somewhere nearby waiting for a reasonable hour, which she found both considerate and slightly unnerving. Forsyth had traded his dress uniform for civilian clothes that still somehow read as military, neat, neutral, the kind of clothes that occupied space without drawing attention. Ferris was compact, measured, with the specific alertness of someone whose job involved listening for what wasn't being said. Nora made coffee she actually poured this time. They sat at her small kitchen table. I'm going to tell you some things, Forsyth said, and I need you to understand that some of them have been classified, not to protect the military, to protect the people involved, including the ones who died. He looked at her steadily. Is that going to be a problem? No? 3 years ago, a joint special operations team was running a classified extraction in a mountainous region outside Kandahar. The target was a compromised intelligence asset, someone who needed to come out fast and without announcement. He paused. The operation went bad. They ran into a secondary insurgent element nobody had intelligence on. Of the 11 team members, 7 were wounded in the first 30 minutes. The senior officer on the ground was incapacitated. He stopped. You were there. I was a combat nurse attached to a forward operating base in that region, she said carefully. You were forward of the FOB. You'd gone out with a medical supply rotation to a smaller outpost, and the extraction team's route took them through that area when everything fell apart. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The classified record of that night shows that a military nurse, identified in the documentation only by rank and a service number, administered field stabilization to 4 critically wounded operators under active fire, directed a defensive perimeter while the surviving team members were extracted, and carried a wounded man 300 meters to the extraction point after the vehicle was disabled. The kitchen was very quiet. "That service number is yours," Forsyth said. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at her coffee. "The reason it's classified, Taha," he continued, "is that the operation itself was classified. The asset that was extracted is still in a protection program. Acknowledging what happened that night in any public record would have created a chain of exposure." He held her gaze. "Ethan Cross was one of the 4 wounded operators you treated that night. He was the man you carried to the extraction point." She remembered a weight. She remembered ground that was uneven, and her lungs burning, and the specific quality of darkness in that landscape. Dense, textured, alive with sound. She remembered making decisions in rapid sequence because there wasn't time to make them slowly, and she remembered that at some point she'd stopped being afraid and become something else. Something very focused and very cold and entirely purposeful. She'd never examined that night closely because examining it required inhabiting it, and she'd decided not to. She remembered a face now, half lit, blood down one side of it, eyes open and tracking. "Keep moving," she'd told him. "I've got you, but you have to keep moving." "He wasn't operational under Cross," she said. "No, he wasn't." Forsyth's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been relief that she'd confirmed the thread without him having to push. "The name you would have known him by was Reeves. That was his operational alias." She put her cup down carefully. "Reeves. Yes." "He's been trying to find you for 2 years, Forsyth said. "When you separated from the service, your records were complicated. You left through a quiet channel, no forwarding information. The classification of that operation meant he couldn't approach the search officially without exposing things that needed to stay protected." He paused. "Then 3 weeks ago, during a routine intelligence liaison, someone ran across a nursing license filing. Harbor Crest, Oregon. NORA WHITAKER." He paused. "He was scheduled for a welfare check on an asset in this region last week. His team was inserted 4 days ago. He was injured before he could make contact. He was injured 36 hours before he was going to walk into this hospital as a visitor." Forsyth held her gaze. "You were the only person he asked for when they pulled him out." She sat with that. Ferris, who had been quiet through all of this, spoke. "We need to ask you something, Nora. And you should know that your answer has no bearing on the clinical review process. That's going to resolve the way it's going to resolve, regardless. Ask. When you recognized the infection pattern last night, the Burkholderia exposure, you said you'd seen that presentation before, in other contexts." Ferris's voice was careful, not unkind. "That knowledge came from your service." "Yes." "And you didn't identify yourself as having military medical background when you were hired at Cascade Ridge." "I listed my qualifications. I didn't elaborate on the context." She looked at Ferris steadily. "That was a choice I made deliberately. I had the right to make it." "You did," Ferris said. "I'm not challenging it. I'm making sure I understand the full picture." "The full picture is that I left a career I was good at because I needed to step away from it, and I built a different life. And last night someone was dying, and I had specific knowledge that could help them." She paused. "I don't think the provenance of the knowledge was the relevant variable." Forsyth almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, the expression of someone who'd been in enough difficult rooms to recognize when a person was handling one well. "Commander Cross would like to see you," he said. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now." They drove back to the hospital separately, Nora in her own car, because she needed that small independence, needed the 5 minutes of driving with her hands on the wheel and the gray sky above Harbor Crest and the familiar streets to remind herself that she was still the same person she'd been at 6 a.m. The knowledge that she was walking back into a building she'd just been effectively expelled from sat in her chest like a stone, but it was manageable. She'd carried heavier things. The ICU floor had a different quality in the morning, calmer, more considered, the particular diurnal rhythm of a unit that never really rested but varied in its intensity. Rosaria was finishing what looked like a double shift, still at the nurse's station, and she looked up when Nora walked in with Forsyth and Ferris flanking her. "He's awake," Rosaria said. "And he's been asking questions about you since sunrise. which is a good sign because it means he has energy to be annoying. She said it with a neutrality that might have been warmth or might have just been exhaustion. Rooms at the end. The door was partially open. Nora stopped outside it and breathed for a moment in a way that she would not have permitted herself if anyone had been watching. Then she pushed it open and went in. He looked worse in daylight than he had in the controlled darkness of the trauma bay. Older, thinner through the face. The kind of worn-down quality that came from years of operating in conditions that accumulated in the body. There were more scars than she would have expected, visible at the collar of the hospital gown, along the forearm that lay outside the blanket. The eye that had been swollen last night was still mostly closed. The other one found her immediately. He didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did she. She'd spent the drive back trying to figure out what this moment was supposed to be. Reunion, or reckoning, or something else entirely. And she still hadn't landed anywhere when he said quietly, "You cut your hair." The 3 words landed so unexpectedly ordinary that she almost laughed. "You've been looking for me for 2 years," she said, "and that's what you lead with." I've had a lot of time to think about what to lead with. Everything else seemed wrong. He shifted slightly against the pillow, careful. There were limits to the movement the chest drainage would allow. "You look good. You look like you got shot." "I did." She moved to the chair beside the bed, the one that was clearly there for that purpose, and sat in it. The monitor tracked his pulse. Steadier than last night, cleaner. The dual antibiotics were running in the line at his arm. "I didn't know who you were last night," she said, "when you asked for me." "I know, Forsyth told me." A pause. "I've known who you were since about 4 hours after we extracted. When I was stable enough to ask questions, my team told me what happened, what you did." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "You weren't supposed to be there. You were a CASEVAC nurse on a supply rotation, not a combat assignment. I was the only medical personnel available. You held that position for 40 minutes while we got the rest of the team out. Someone had to." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude, exactly. Gratitude was smaller than this. "I asked for a debrief when I was recovered enough. They told me your record was classified in connection with the operation, that you'd separated from service, that they couldn't provide contact information. They said it like that was the end of the sentence." His jaw tightened slightly. "It wasn't the end of the sentence for me. 2 years is a long time to look for someone. You were hard to find. I meant to be." She said it without apology because there wasn't any to offer. He nodded, like that was a fair answer, which it was. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And Forsyth is going to tell you the official version later, so I want you to hear the human version first." He adjusted his arm slightly, careful of the IV. "What you did that night, the classification on the operation means it's never been acknowledged. Officially, you're in the records as a medical support asset who performs standard CASEVAC functions under field conditions. Nothing more." He held her gaze. "That's not what happened. And the people who were on that mountain with me, the ones who came home, they know it isn't what happened. We've spent 2 years knowing it and not being able to do anything about it." The room was very still. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel a certain way about it," he said. "You probably have complicated feelings about that whole period that I don't have full visibility into. I get that." A pause. "I'm telling you because that's about to change. The classification on that operation has been under review. It's going to be lifted by... Not completely. There are elements that will stay protected, but the combat actions, the personnel involved, the specific things that happened on that mountain..." He stopped. "You're going to get your record back, Nora. The real one." She didn't know what she'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. She sat with it. "When?" she said. "The formal process takes about 30 days from authorization. Authorization came through 6 days ago." He watched her face. "I pushed for it when we found you. I've been pushing for it for 2 years." Outside the room, in the hallway, she could hear voices. The normal operational sounds of a hospital floor, nurses and residents, and the distant ping of a monitor. The regular world continuing at its regular pace. "What does that actually mean?" she said slowly. "In practical terms. Given..." She gestured vaguely, which covered administrative leave and Diane Mercer and everything that had built up over 2 years in this building. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what she was gesturing at. It means that very shortly, the people who have been treating you like a liability are going to discover that they've been doing that to someone with a classified combat commendation and the active advocacy of a special operations command. He paused. And it means that the meeting that happened in your director's office this morning is going to look very different in about 48 hours than it looked this morning. Nora pressed her back into the chair. 48 hours. 2 days. She tried to hold that against the weight of 2 years. Diane's comments in meetings, the file notations, the rumors, the specific grinding exhaustion of being dismissed by people who had no idea what they were dismissing. And it felt both enormous and somehow insufficient, the way a door opening onto something large always looks smaller than the thing behind it. "Why didn't you tell Callahan this morning?" she asked. "Forsyth was there. We could have." Cross nodded. "But that's not how I wanted this to go. I didn't want you cleared because a colonel walked into a room and made the problem disappear by outranking it. That just means the problem goes underground." He met her eyes. "I wanted the record to speak, the documentation, the clinical outcome, the full picture of who you are and what you know and why this hospital should be grateful to have you on their floor. I wanted it to land the right way." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while. I've had 43 hours on a helicopter and in this bed to think about very little else." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. "I'm thorough." She almost said something. She wasn't sure what. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Priya's name on the screen. She looked at Cross. "Excuse me." She stepped into the hallway. Answered. "Priya." "Where are you?" Priya's voice was tight. "I've been trying to reach you." "I'm at the hospital. What happened?" "Mercer filed the formal suspension request an hour ago. Callahan signed it." A pause. "But that's not—" "Nora, that's not the main thing. Security pulled footage from last night. From the ICU. Mercer's on camera, in the hallway, making a call about 3 minutes before she came into that room and told you to leave." Priya's voice dropped. "She was on the phone with someone in administration. The footage has audio." "What did she say?" Priya was quiet for just long enough that Nora felt the hair on her arms lift. She said, "It doesn't matter what the nurse does. Make sure the paperwork goes through before she can prove anything." The hallway of the ICU stretched out in both directions, ordinary, institutional, humming with the quiet machinery of the floor. Nora stood in it and felt something settle in her chest, not triumph, not relief, something colder and more precise. "Who pulled the footage?" she asked. "That's the thing." Priya hesitated. "It wasn't our security team. It was someone from an outside office. Federal, I think. They came in about 20 minutes ago with credentials that made our security director go very quiet very fast." Nora turned and looked through the window in the door at the end of the hall. Cross was lying in the bed, eyes on the ceiling, the monitor tracking steady. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't performing anything. He was just lying there, breathing carefully around the chest drainage, looking like a man who had set a great many things in motion and was now waiting, with the particular patience of someone trained to wait, for them to arrive. She pushed the door back open. "The federal team that came in this morning," she said, "the ones who pulled the security footage. Was that yours?" He turned his head and looked at her. "I told you," he said. "I wanted it to land the right way." She didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he'd just told her, so she put her phone back in her pocket and stood in the doorway for a moment and let the weight of it settle. "I need to go," she said. "There are things I need to handle." "I know." He held her gaze. "Ferris will be your contact for anything procedural. She knows everything, whatever you need." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. The operational composure cracking slightly at the edges, the way things do when someone has been holding them together for a long time and can finally stop. "Nora, I'm glad you were there last night." She almost said, "So am I," but that wasn't quite right either. What she felt wasn't gladness. It was something more complicated, something that didn't have a clean name yet. "Get some sleep," she said instead. You look terrible." She left before he could answer. The next 6 hours moved the way institutional machinery moves when it's been forced into a direction it wasn't traveling. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but with a grinding, inexorable momentum that was worse than friction because it couldn't be stopped, only weathered. Ferris met her in the lobby with a folder and a specific kind of calm that Nora was beginning to understand was the woman's baseline. "The footage is being reviewed by our team, and a copy has been provided to the hospital's legal counsel," Ferris said. "Counsel has advised Director Callahan that the documentation creates significant institutional liability." "How significant?" "Enough that he's already requested a second meeting." Ferris glanced at her. "This afternoon, 4 o'clock. You should be there." "Am I still suspended?" "You're on administrative leave," which Callahan signed without reviewing the clinical documentation Vasquez submitted this morning. "Documentation that characterizes your intervention as not only appropriate but essential." Ferris's tone didn't carry judgment, just the facts arranged in the order that made their meaning obvious. "That sequence is going to be relevant." Nora nodded. She understood sequences. She spent the intervening hours in the hospital's family waiting area on the second floor, which was quiet at midday and had decent light and was one of the few spaces in the building where nobody was going to find her and require something from her. She called her landlord about a plumbing issue she'd been ignoring. She ate a sandwich from the vending machine that was worse than it looked. She sat with the morning's information and let it move through her the way hard things had to move. Not analyzed, not managed, just allowed. Kandahar, Ethan Cross, her father. That last part hadn't come yet, not fully. Forsyth had mentioned it in the hallway the night before, and she'd filed it as something to examine later, and later kept not arriving. She knew her father had died when she was 19, a quiet man who'd worked in federal contracting and never said much about what the work involved. She'd inherited his stillness and his capacity for silence, and she'd always understood those as just temperament, the genetic freight of being his daughter. She put that down. The present was full enough. At 3:45, she walked to the administrative floor. The meeting was larger than the mornings. Callahan had his legal counsel present, a woman in her 40s named Barrett, who had the specific alertness of someone reading the terrain for exits. Diane was there, but something had shifted in her positioning since that morning. She was further from Callahan's desk, and the folder was gone from her lap. And there was a quality to her stillness now that wasn't composure. It was the stillness of someone who had received information and hadn't finished processing what it meant. Holt wasn't there. That was its own kind of information. Ferris had brought a second person Nora hadn't met, a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as a representative from the Regional Office of Inspector General and did not elaborate on this. Callahan looked at him the way people look at things that have appeared in rooms they didn't invite them into and cannot ask to leave. Ferris set a document on the desk. Clinical Outcome Report, submitted this morning by Dr. Sasha Vasquez, attending physician. Her characterization of Nurse Whitaker's intervention is in the highlighted sections. She waited while Callahan's counsel picked it up. Additionally, our office has completed a preliminary review of security footage from last night and identified audio recording of a conversation in the ICU corridor that we consider directly relevant to the conduct question before this institution. Callahan looked at Diane. Diane looked at the wall to the right of Callahan's head. The Inspector General's representative opened a laptop. He turned it toward the room. He pressed play. The audio quality wasn't perfect. Hallway footage rarely was, but it was clear enough. Diane's voice, recognizable, clipped. "It doesn't matter what the nurse does. Make sure the paperwork goes through before she can prove anything." A pause. Then the other end of the line, quieter but present. "When?" And Diane. "Now. Before morning." The recording lasted 11 seconds. The room was silent for a moment after it ended. "That call," Ferris said, "was made to the office of Assistant Administrator Roland Tice, who oversees clinical review processing. Mr. Tice expedited the formal complaint filing at 2:10 a.m. That's 2 hours before standard processing opens and 40 minutes after this recording was made." She looked at Callahan. We believe this constitutes a coordinated effort to process a retaliatory personnel action against Nurse Whitaker before her clinical intervention could be formally documented and associated with a patient outcome. Barrett, the counsel, was writing. She had the focused economy of someone identifying exactly how bad something was. Diane said, "That call was taken out of context. Ms. Mercer." The Inspector General's representative's voice was quiet and absolute. "I'd advise you not to elaborate on that point at this time." Diane's mouth closed. Something shifted in the room then. A rebalancing of weight, slow but irreversible. The kind of shift that happens when an argument loses the floor, not through shouting, but through the arrival of evidence that makes shouting unnecessary. Callahan was looking at his desk. Barrett had stopped writing and was looking at Callahan. The Inspector General's representative was closing his laptop with the unhurried precision of someone whose work in this room was essentially done. Nora sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. She had the specific sensation of watching something she'd been pressing against for 2 years begin to give way. Not collapsing, not yet, but the first fracture lines appearing, the structure starting to acknowledge what had always been true about it. Callahan looked up at her. He looked tired in a way that was different from the morning, less managed, more real. "Nora," he said, "the administrative leave is rescinded, effective immediately. You're restored to your full clinical rotation pending completion of the formal review, which," he glanced at Barrett, who nodded almost imperceptibly, "which I expect will conclude in your favor." Diane's chair scraped back slightly. "Paul, Diane." He turned to her, and there was something in his voice Nora had never heard him use before, but not anger, but finality. "I'm going to need you to step back from your supervisory duties while we conduct an internal investigation into last night's events and the handling of the complaint filing." He paused. "HR will be in contact tomorrow morning." Diane stood. She looked at Nora, not with the calculating composure she'd worn in every previous encounter, but with something rawer and less arranged, the face underneath the face. "You should have just stayed in your lane," she said. Nora looked at her. "Someone would have died if I had." Diane walked out. The room exhaled. Callahan asked Nora 2 more procedural questions. Ferris answered one of them on her behalf. The Inspector General's representative handed Barrett a card and said something quiet about follow-up documentation. The meeting ended in the particular low-key way that consequential things sometimes ended. Not with ceremony, just with people gathering their materials and standing, and the room returning to a room. Nora was in the corridor heading back toward the elevator when Priya appeared from around the corner, moving fast. Her face had an expression on it that Nora had not seen before. Not the tightly managed composure of a resident managing stress, but something cracked open and urgent. "You need to come upstairs," Priya said. "Right now." "What happened?" "Cross's vitals just went critical. Fever spiked to 104.8. His pressure is gone again." Priya was already turning back toward the elevator. "And there's something in the new blood work that Vasquez is saying she's never seen before. Something about the infection pattern. She's saying it doesn't match the organism you identified. She's saying it's something else on top of it." Nora was already moving. "She's been trying to reach you for 20 minutes, Priya said, "because she's looking at this panel and she says she doesn't know what she's treating." The elevator ride took 19 seconds. Nora counted them without meaning to, the way she counted things when her mind was running ahead of her body and needed something to anchor it. Vasquez met them at the ICU doors. She was a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct manner that came from 30 years of making fast decisions with incomplete information. She had a tablet in one hand and a printout in the other, and she looked at Nora the way people looked at things they weren't sure how to classify. "I need you to look at this panel," she said, handing over the printout without preamble. "Tell me what you see." Nora looked. It took her about 8 seconds. "When did this draw come back?" 40 minutes ago. I've been running it against every database we have access to. The Burkholderia is still present. Your call on that was right. It's responding to the dual therapy, slowly. But there's a second organism. The morphology is wrong for anything standard. The inflammatory markers are going in a direction that doesn't track with either a bacterial superinfection or a drug reaction. Vasquez pointed at 2 specific lines on the panel. That pattern, I've seen something adjacent to it once in my career. toxin-mediated. But the toxin profile doesn't match anything I can identify. Nora looked at the lines. She looked at the fever number at the top of the sheet. 104.8, climbing when this was drawn, probably higher now. She thought about wound contamination, about the specific conditions of the place where Ethan Cross had been injured, about things she'd encountered in field medicine that had no civilian corollary because they didn't exist in civilian contexts. Was there any debris recovered from the wound, she asked, during the initial surgical clean? Some. It's been sent for analysis. Pull it back from the lab. I need to know if there's any organic material, so plant matter specifically, something that wouldn't normally be in a GSW wound. Vasquez looked at her. You think this is botanical? I think I've seen a toxin-mediated inflammatory cascade that looks almost exactly like this, and the source was plant-based, specific genus, specific region. Nora handed the printout back. If I'm right, the treatment protocol is completely different from what you're running. And if you're wrong, then we've wasted time on a lab reanalysis, and his deterioration continues on its current trajectory, which your current protocol isn't stopping anyway. Nora kept her voice level. What's his pressure right now? 82/48 when I left the room 5 minutes ago. Priya made a small sound. Pull the debris, Nora said. And I need to make a call. She stepped into the corridor outside the unit and called Forsyth. He answered on the second ring. What was the operational terrain, she said without introduction. Specifically, vegetation, water sources, altitude. I need to know what he was moving through in the 48 hours before he was extracted. A pause. That's classified. He's going to die in about 2 hours if you keep it classified. The pause was shorter this time. High altitude. Significant ground cover, mixed brush, some kind of low shrub growth the team described as dense. There was a water crossing. One of the team noted it was stagnant, a flood basin that hadn't drained. He stopped. Why? Because the Burkhold area is a secondary issue now. There's something else in his system that's riding the initial infection and the wound site. If the terrain matches what I'm thinking, the wound was contaminated with organic material from a specific plant genus that produces a glycoside toxin. It presents as a toxin-mediated cascade, looks like sepsis, but the inflammatory pathway is different. She was already moving back toward the ICU doors. If that's what this is, meropenem isn't doing anything to it. He needs activated charcoal lavage and a specific binding agent, and he needs them before the cardiac involvement gets worse. Cardiac? The toxin has a secondary effect on cardiac conduction. It's slow, which is why nobody flagged it last night, because the GSW presentation was masking the early signs. But his pressure isn't dropping because the infection is winning. It's dropping because his conduction system is being disrupted. Forsyth was quiet for 2 seconds. What do you need from me? Tell me if there was any vegetation in the wound when they stabilized him in the field. Anything they noted as unusual. She heard him pull away from the phone, speak to someone. A wait. Then, one of the field medics noted what he described as dark fibrous material in the wound cavity. He assumed it was fabric contamination from the uniform. It wasn't fabric. Okay, she said. Nora, I've got it. She went back through the doors. Matt. Vasquez listened to all of it in about 90 seconds, the kind of compressed information transfer that good clinicians learned because there was never enough time. Her expression moved through skepticism, calculation, and something that wasn't quite belief but was close enough to act on. I've never treated botanical glycoside toxicity in a trauma context, she said. Neither have most people. Nora looked at her directly. But the pathway is documented. The treatment protocol exists. If we run the lavage and start the binding agent, and I'm wrong, his GI tract has a bad afternoon. If we don't run it, and I'm right, his heart rate is going to hit a conduction block in the next 60 to 90 minutes, and we won't get it back. Vasquez looked at the monitor through the window, looked at the panel in her hand, looked at Nora. Walk me through the dosing, she said. They worked for the next 4 hours in the way that real medical emergencies actually worked. Not with clean dramatic momentum, but with grinding iterative difficulty, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. A treatment that produced an immediate worsening before it produced improvement. A cardiac event at the 90-minute mark that had everyone in the room moving very fast and very quietly, and that resolved, finally, after 11 minutes that felt considerably longer, into a rhythm that was unstable but present. Cross was conscious for parts of it, not in a useful way. Fever conscious, which meant aware enough to be agitated and not aware enough to understand what was happening around him. He said something once that nobody could make out. Nora was adjusting the IV line at the time, and she was close enough to hear it, and what she heard was a name she didn't recognize, said in the specific tone of someone trying to report something important and losing the thread. She filed it. By 7 p.m., his temperature had dropped to 102.1. His pressure was 96/62 and holding. The conduction irregularity was still present on the monitor, but the specific pattern that had indicated advancing block had smoothed. Vasquez looked at the readout for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora across the bed. "You need to be on staff here," she said. "I mean that clinically, not as a compliment." "I am on staff here," Nora said. "Callahan reinstated me about 3 hours ago." Vasquez blinked. "What?" Long afternoon. Mountain. She left the ICU at 7:30 when Cross was stable enough that Vasquez had the situation fully in hand, and Nora's continued presence was support rather than necessity. Her legs ached. She hadn't eaten since the vending machine sandwich at noon. She took the stairs down because she needed the movement, needed the physical simplicity of descending steps to counterweight the day's accumulated complexity. On the second-floor landing, she stopped. Roland Tice was coming up. She knew him by sight, mid-level hospital administrator, the kind of institutional middle manager who existed in every large organization, competent enough to hold the position without being exceptional enough to progress past it. 50s, thinning hair, the particular bearing of someone accustomed to being not quite significant. She'd had minimal direct interaction with him in 2 years, which she now understood had been the point. He saw her and stopped. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has been moving through a day believing he is invisible and has just realized he isn't. "Ms. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Tice." He looked like he was going to say something else. He didn't. She kept moving down the stairs. The thing about institutional complicity was that it was almost never dramatic. It was people like Tice making small decisions. Expedite this filing. Ignore that timestamp. Answer the phone at 2 a.m. because the person calling had access to your performance review. It was 1,000 incremental choices that added up to a pattern that only became visible when someone laid all the pieces on a table and looked at them together. Tice hadn't set out to harm her specifically. He'd set out to not harm himself, which in practice had amounted to the same thing. The Inspector General's representative had taken a copy of the audio and the filing timestamps and the access logs from the complaint system. She didn't need to do anything about Tice. The picture was already building without her. She pushed through the stairwell door into the lobby and almost walked directly into Priya. "I've been waiting for you," Priya said. "I need to show you something." They went to a consultation room off the main corridor. Small, windowless, the kind of space used for family conversations that needed privacy. Priya had her laptop and she set it on the table and pulled up a personnel database that Nora was fairly sure residents weren't supposed to have full access to, which she chose not to comment on. "Mercer's file," Priya said. "I've been looking at it since this morning, not because I was supposed to. I wasn't, but something kept nagging at me, and I finally figured out what it was." She pulled up a section of employment history. "Look at the timeline." Nora leaned in. Diane had been at Cascade Ridge for 23 years. Before that, a 3-year position at a hospital in Eastern Oregon that Nora didn't recognize. Before that, 2 years somewhere else. Standard enough. But the performance reviews from her first decade at Cascade Ridge, visible in the file, because Priya had apparently found a way into the archival documentation, told a different story than the senior charge nurse's current status implied. She had 2 formal disciplinary actions in her first 5 years here, Priya said, pointing. One for falsifying a patient contact note, one for filing an unsubstantiated complaint against a physician. She looked at Nora. The physician complaint was eventually withdrawn, but not before the physician resigned. The falsification. It was reviewed and the notation was removed from her active file by an administrator 2 years later. That administrator's name is in the amendment record. Nora looked at the name. Paul Callahan. Before he was director, when he'd been an administrative manager in the clinical operations division. He cleaned her record, Nora said. He amended it, which technically he had the authority to do in that role. Priya's voice was careful. I'm not saying it was necessarily improper, but it means he's known about a pattern in her conduct for over 15 years, and he kept her in a supervisory position, and when she filed against you, she stopped. He moved fast to act on it. Nora sat back. Callahan's quick compliance with the suspension that morning. She'd attributed it to his general caution, his tendency to manage risk by containing the immediate problem. But if he'd known about Diane's history with unsubstantiated complaints, known about the falsification, and still cleared her record and maintained her in a position of authority, then the speed with which he'd signed the leave order wasn't just caution, it was something else. She thought about the meeting that afternoon. Callahan's legal counsel, Barrett, writing steadily. The Inspector General's representative and his closed laptop. Callahan looking at his desk. He was scared, she realized. Not of Ferris or the federal presence in general. Of this. Of exactly what Priya had just found. The audio recording and the filing timestamp were a problem he could navigate if it stayed contained to Diane and Tice. But if the investigation expanded to include the question of why a charge nurse with a documented history of falsification and bad faith complaints had been kept in a supervisory role for 15 years, that was a different question entirely, and it had his name attached to an answer he couldn't afford. His reinstatement of her that afternoon hadn't been a concession, it had been damage control. Who else has seen this? She asked. Nobody. I found it about an hour ago. Priya looked at her. What do you want to do with it? Nora thought about what Cross had said. I wanted it to land the right way. Not a quick resolution, not a problem made to disappear by external pressure. The real picture, properly documented, reaching the people who needed to see it. Send it to Ferris, she said. Use the contact number on the card she gave me this morning. Send the full file, the timeline, the amendment record, all of it. She paused. And Priya, whatever you access to get this, make sure you document that you had clinical grounds for the review. Did I have clinical grounds? A charge nurse was involved in conduct that affected patient care last night. Reviewing her personnel file for relevant behavioral history is supportable. Nora held her gaze. Make sure it's written that way. Priya nodded, already pulling up her email. Mugged. At 8:15, Nora was back in the ICU. Cross was sleeping. Real sleep, not fever sleep, his breathing slower and more even, the monitor showing a rhythm that was still imperfect but was trending towards something sustainable. Rosaria was at the end of her third consecutive shift and looked like a person assembled from habit and spite, but she was still there, and she gave Nora a nod when she came in that carried more weight than most conversations Nora had had that day. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She wasn't sure why. She told herself she was doing a final check on the IV lines and the drainage and the current medication rates, which was true, but it took about 4 minutes and she stayed considerably longer than that. The room was quiet except for the monitor. She thought about her father. She'd been thinking about him in pieces since Forsyth mentioned him the night before, not the memory of him, which she kept carefully, but the idea of him that she might have had wrong. He'd been a man of few words and precise habits who'd worked for a federal contractor and come home every evening and made dinner and asked about her day with the specific attentiveness of someone who wanted to know and wasn't sure how to show it. He'd died of a cardiac event when she was 19 and she'd stood at his funeral in November rain and understood for the first time that some questions would never get answered. If he'd been something other than what he appeared, if the ordinary life had been a layer over something larger, she didn't know yet whether that was a comfort or a loss. Maybe both. Some things were both. She was still in the chair when her phone buzzed. Ferris. She stepped into the hallway. I got the file Priya sent, Ferris said. The amendment record with Callahan's authorization. A pause. This changes the scope of our review. I thought it might. Nora. Ferris's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but more considered. I want to make sure you understand what's likely to happen next. When an IG investigation expands to include institutional leadership, it tends to... The process becomes more visible, more public. People inside the institution become aware of it. You're telling me it's going to get harder before it gets resolved. I'm telling you that the people who have something to lose are going to understand what they have to lose, and they won't all respond the way Callahan did. Some of them will go quiet, some won't. A pause. Diane Mercer's legal representation contacted our office an hour ago. They're indicating she may cooperate with the investigation in exchange for considerations. She's going to give up Callahan. She's going to give up whoever she needs to give up. That's how these things move. Ferris paused. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when the building changes temperature tomorrow. Nora looked through the window at Cross, sleeping. Thank you, she said. She ended the call. She was walking back toward the elevator when she saw them. Two men she didn't recognize, in civilian clothes that didn't read civilian. The same quality Forsyth had, the same occupation of space that was too precise to be accidental. They were standing near the ICU entry, and they were looking at their phones, and they were not, she understood after a moment of watching, looking at their phones. They were monitoring the corridor, additional security. Cross's protection detail had expanded. She was about to continue toward the elevator when one of them straightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, and she tracked his sight line to the far end of the corridor. Diane Mercer was standing at the end of the hall. She wasn't in scrubs. She was in her street clothes, a coat, a bag over her shoulder. The clothes of someone who had been told to leave the building and had left and had come back. She was looking at the ICU door, not at Nora. At the ICU door with an expression that Nora couldn't read cleanly from 40 feet, but that had something in it that wasn't grief or anger or fear, but was all three of those things pressed into the specific shape of someone who has decided something. And then Diane's eyes moved and found Nora's. And in the 3 seconds before the security detail moved toward her, Nora saw something that she recognized with a cold, settling certainty. Not malice, not the composed institutional hostility of 2 years of meetings and file notations, but something rawer and more specific. Diane wasn't here for Nora. She was here for Cross. The two security personnel were already moving, their body language changing from monitored neutral to active approach. And Diane took one step back and then stopped. And in the moment before everything in the hallway began happening at once, Nora's phone rang. It was a Harbor Crest number she didn't know. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Miss Whitaker. A man's voice, low, controlled, with the specific flatness of someone reading from a prepared statement or fighting very hard not to sound afraid. My name is Keith Alderman. I was a clinical coordinator under Director Callahan for 11 years. A breath. I need to tell you something about why Diane Mercer was placed in her current position, about what she's been covering for. A pause that lasted long enough that she thought the line had dropped. And about what she has access to in this building that she was never supposed to have. Down the hallway, the security detail had reached Diane. She wasn't fighting them. She was standing with her hands at her sides looking at the ICU door, and she said something that Nora was too far away to hear, and one of the security personnel reached for his radio. Mr. Alderman, Nora said, where are you right now? Parking structure, level 2. His voice had dropped further. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to decide whether to call you. There are things in this building that the IG review isn't going to find unless someone tells them where to look. What kind of things? A silence. The kind, he said quietly, that explain why a special operations commander getting treatment in your ICU is a problem for more than one person in this hospital. Stay where you are, Nora said. Don't get out of your car. I'm coming to you. She was already moving toward the stairwell. Behind her, down the corridor, she heard one of the security personnel say something into his radio, clipped, professional, the specific tone of a person reporting a situation upward. She didn't look back at Diane. Whatever was happening there was in hands that could manage it. What was in the parking structure on level 2 was not. She took the stairs because the elevator had a camera and she needed 30 seconds to think. Keith Alderman, clinical coordinator, 11 years under Callahan. She ran the name against everything she knew about the administrative structure at Cascade Ridge and came up with almost nothing, which was itself information. 11 years was a long tenure for a coordinator-level position. Either he'd been content with the work, or he'd been kept there, or both. She pushed through the parking structure door. Level 2 was half empty at this hour, the overhead lights cycling through their dim maintenance mode and leaving long shadows between the cars. She scanned for someone sitting alone and found him in the third row. A gray sedan, interior dark, a man in his late 40s with the specific collapsed posture of someone who had been holding tension for a long time and recently stopped. She knocked on the passenger window. He unlocked it. The inside of the car smelled like coffee and recycled air. Alderman had the look of a man who'd aged several years in a single day. Pale, controlled, his hands wrapped around a paper cup he wasn't drinking from. He glanced at her and then looked at the windshield, which was apparently easier. "How did you get my number?" she asked. "Priya." He said it simply. "She called me this afternoon. She was asking questions about Callahan's personnel decisions, and she mentioned your name, and I—" He stopped. "I've been thinking about calling someone for about 8 months. I just couldn't figure out who to call." "Tell me about the access," she said. He turned the cup in his hands. When Cascade Ridge upgraded its pharmaceutical inventory system 3 years ago, Callahan oversaw the implementation. Part of the system, the controlled substance tracking, the override documentation, the chain of custody records, it was supposed to be locked behind dual authorization. 2 administrators, both required to approve any access outside normal clinical channels. He paused. Callahan had the dual auth requirement removed for the head of clinical operations and the charge nurse supervisors. He said it was for emergency efficiency. The override was logged internally, but it wasn't flagged to the state medical board the way it was required to be. Diane Mercer is a charge nurse supervisor. Has been for 12 years. She has unilateral access to the controlled substance override system. No second signature required. He finally looked at her. "I found out 8 months ago when I was auditing a discrepancy in the fentanyl inventory. There were entries that shouldn't have been there. Not large amounts, not the kind of thing that trips an automatic alert, but consistent. Small, regular, documented under patient case numbers that I checked against the actual patient records, and..." He stopped. "The patients didn't exist. 4 of the case numbers were fabricated." The parking structure was very quiet. "You're saying Diane has been diverting controlled substances," Nora said. "I'm saying someone has been using the override access assigned to Diane Mercer's credentials to divert controlled substances, and that those credentials require her physical badge and a pin that she sets herself." He looked back at the windshield. "I brought it to Callahan, in writing, with documentation, 8 months ago. And he told me the discrepancy had been reviewed and resolved. He reassigned me to an administrative support role and moved someone else into my coordinator position." He paused. "The discrepancies continued. I kept a copy of everything." Nora sat with this for a moment. The shape of it was becoming clear. Not a simple bullying campaign, not even a simple institutional cover-up, but something with weight and specific stakes. Something Diane had leverage over Callahan about because Callahan had buried the first report. And something that a federal investigation into ICU conduct at a hospital currently housing a classified military patient would inevitably find if it looked at the right records. Diane, standing in the hallway with her coat and her bag, wasn't someone who'd come back for a confrontation. It was someone who understood that the clock had just run out and was trying to assess the damage. "The copies you kept," Nora said. "Where are they?" He reached into the back seat and produced a manila envelope. "I printed everything. There's also a thumb drive." She took it. "I need you to talk to someone tonight. Her name is Lieutenant Colonel Adele Ferris. She's with the Inspector General's office. Federal, not hospital. She has the authority to protect you from any institutional retaliation for this, and she has the jurisdiction to pull the inventory records independently." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" He looked at the envelope. "Is this going to end up in court?" "Probably, yes." A long pause. "Okay," he said. "Bess," Ferris answered on the first ring. Nora gave her alderman's name, location, and the 60-second version of what he'd told her. Then she stood outside the gray sedan in the parking structure and listened to the sound of an investigation pivoting. The brief silence on the line, while Ferris processed and reordered, the specific efficiency of someone who was very good at their work, encountering a piece of information that made everything cohere. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Ferris said. Stay with him until I arrive. Nora leaned against the car and waited. She thought about Diane standing in that hallway. She thought about 12 years of unilateral access and fabricated case numbers and the specific kind of institutional rot that grew in places where no one was willing to look directly at the smell. She thought about 2 years of being called a problem, a liability, someone who didn't understand how things worked, and how much easier it was to call someone a problem if that someone's continued presence created the risk of someone eventually looking at the right records. She hadn't been a threat to Diane's professional ego. She'd been a threat to Diane's exposure, and Callahan had understood that, had known what Diane had access to and what she needed protected, and had made his calculations accordingly. The anger was there. She didn't suppress it. She let it sit where it was, cold and specific and appropriate, because pretending it wasn't there would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Ferris arrived in 9 minutes. She didn't sleep that night either. She went home at 11, showered, lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, and was back at the hospital by 5:30 because there was nowhere else she could usefully be, and the stillness of her apartment had become unbearable. Cross was better, not well. He had weeks of recovery ahead of him, and the glycoside toxicity had done measurable damage to his cardiac conduction that would need monitoring and possibly intervention. But his fever had broken at 2 a.m., his pressure was holding in the 90s, and Vasquez's night note characterized his trajectory as guarded but improving. Nora read the note at the nurse's station and felt something in her shoulders drop that she hadn't noticed was raised. Rosaria had finally gone home. The morning charge was a man named Teo, who she barely knew and who looked at her with the expression that was becoming common. A complicated mix of respect and wariness. The look people gave someone they'd been told one story about and were now revising in real time. "He was asking for you around 4, Teo said. "I told him you weren't here." "I'll go in." Cross was awake, propped slightly against the pillow, monitoring his own vitals on the wall display with the professional interest of someone who understood what the numbers meant. He looked worse than he had yesterday, which was the paradox of genuine recovery. The way the body sometimes looked more damaged once it had the resources to acknowledge what it had been through. The fever had left him hollowed out, but his eyes were clear. "You broke the fever," he said. "Vasquez and the night team broke the fever. I was home. Vasquez told me this morning what you identified." He paused. "Twice in 2 days. You're more complicated than a standard GSW." Something moved in his expression that was almost humor, but had too much weight beneath it. "Story of my career." He shifted carefully, watching the drainage tube. "Forsyth briefed me this morning. The IG investigation, Callahan Mercer." A pause. "The controlled substance thing. You heard. He tells me everything eventually." He looked at her. "How are you handling it?" The question surprised her. Not its content, but its delivery, the specific quality of someone asking because they actually wanted to know, and not because social convention required it. "I'm handling it," she said. "That's not what I asked." She sat in the chair. "I'm angry. I know the anger is appropriate. I'm trying not to let it become the main thing I'm carrying because it's heavy, and I have other things to carry." She paused. "That's probably more of an answer than you needed." "No," he said. "That's exactly the right amount." They sat in the quiet for a moment. Outside the room, the floor moved through its morning routines. "Forsyth is going to talk to you today," Cross said, "about the classification review, about your record." He held her gaze. "I want you to hear it from him officially, but I want you to know before he comes in that what's in that record, it's not going to feel small. The people who authorized it weren't cavalier about what you did. They documented it the way it deserved to be documented. They just locked it away somewhere it couldn't be seen." He paused. "You're going to see it today." She didn't know what to do with that. She said, "Okay. Also." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back. "He's going to tell you about your father. I want to give you the option to hear that without me in the room." "I can hear it anywhere." "I know you can. I'm offering you the choice." A pause. "It's going to matter to you. I want you to have a say in how it lands." She looked at him. This man she'd carried 300 meters in the dark 3 years ago, who'd spent 2 years looking for her, who'd pulled a federal investigation into orbit around a hospital in Harbor Crest, Oregon, because someone had tried to push her out of a room where a patient needed her. He was doing all of this from a hospital bed with a chest drain and a recovering cardiac arrhythmia, and he was asking her about her preferences. "Tell me now," she said. "Before Forsyth. I'd rather hear it first from someone who—" She stopped. "Someone who what?" "Someone who doesn't have to read it off a page." He nodded. He gathered himself slightly, the way people did when they were about to say something they'd been holding a long time. "Your father's name in the service was different from the name you knew. He worked in a classified intelligence support role from the mid-'80s through 2003. The specific operation we're authorized to acknowledge involved the protection of military and intelligence personnel in 3 separate overseas postings. Situations where advanced information he developed prevented direct action against American assets." A pause. "The record says at least 14 people came home because of work he did that he was never allowed to tell anyone about." He met her eyes. "He knew what you were doing when you enlisted. He knew what unit you were attached to. He requested a briefing on your assignment through back channels that he technically didn't have access to anymore. Someone gave it to him anyway because of who he was." Another pause. "He died knowing you were following something he'd spent his whole career believing in. He just couldn't tell you that he'd been living it too." The room was very quiet. Nora looked at the window. Gray morning light, the hills above Harbor Crest visible in the distance, the kind of ordinary Pacific Northwest morning that her father would have recognized from photographs if she'd ever sent him any. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for it easily, never had been. Her father's daughter in that regard too, it turned out. But something settled in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. A specific unresolved weight that she'd carried since she was 19 and standing in November rain and understanding that some questions would never get answered. Some of them had, it turned out, just late. "Thank you," she said. "It's yours." It always was. Forsyth came at 9, with documentation and the formal language of an official record being unsealed, and Nora sat in the family consultation room and read her own file for the first time. It was strange reading an account of a night she remembered from the inside, the clinical notes of a military medical review, the action citations, the specific language of people who processed extraordinary things into procedural documentation because that was the only container available. She recognized the events. She didn't recognize herself in the description, not at first. The language was formal, attributed, distant. And then she read a notation from one of the surviving operators, a statement collected in the debrief. And she did recognize it, because it was the specific truth of that night without any ceremony around it. She didn't tell us it would be okay. She told us what to do next. That's the only thing that worked. She put the document down. "The formal commendation ceremony is at the discretion of the relevant command," Forsyth said, "but the timeline is approximately 30 days from today. You'll be notified through official channels. It will be public. That's part of the classification lift. The actions need to be acknowledged on the record." He paused. "You can have input on the format. Some people want it small, some don't. I'll think about it. Take your time." He started to gather his materials, then stopped. "One more thing. The Operational Review Board is recommending that the field medicine protocols you applied, the toxin identification approach, the dual pathogen recognition framework, be incorporated into combat medical training curriculum, with attribution." He looked at her directly. "You developed that pattern recognition in the field. The board wants it in the record as your methodology, not just an unattributed clinical approach." She hadn't expected that. She sat with it. "Okay," she said. "Bon guy." The building changed temperature over the next 48 hours, the way Ferris had warned her it would. Callahan resigned on the second morning. He didn't make a statement. There was a brief HR notification to senior staff, a line about pursuing other opportunities, the administrative language of managed exits. His resignation had been preceded, Nora learned through Priya, who learned it through the particular information ecology of hospital break rooms, by a 4-hour meeting with legal counsel and a representative from the State Medical Licensing Board. The inventory audit that Ferris's team ran in the 36 hours following Alderman's disclosure had produced documentation that made Callahan's continued presence untenable on approximately 6 different regulatory grounds. Roland Tice resigned the same day. His exit was quieter. An email to his direct reports, personal items collected from his office in a single box, the particular defeated efficiency of a man who understood the shape of what was coming and chose to move before it arrived. Diane Mercer did not resign. Diane Mercer was terminated. The distinction mattered because termination created a record that resignation didn't, and Ferris's team had been specific about preserving that record. The termination was for cause. The formal documentation cited unauthorized personnel actions, the audio recording, and the controlled substance investigation, which had produced enough evidence to refer the matter to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal charges. The referral was pending. Nora wasn't in the building when any of these things happened. She was on her scheduled shift, doing her work, and she learned about each development the way she'd learned about most things in this building. Someone found her to tell her, and she listened and nodded and went back to what she was doing. It wasn't that she was unmoved. She was moved. But the movement was quieter than she'd expected, not the sharp relief of a pressure releasing, more like the slow returning warmth of something that had been cold for a long time. She'd spent 2 years in this building being managed and minimized and told in 100 subtle ways that her judgment was a problem, and her history was irrelevant, and her presence was something to be processed rather than valued. The exit of the people who'd built that structure wasn't a victory exactly. It was a correction. Those were different things. On the 3rd day, a woman named Ingrid Solberg arrived at Cascade Ridge. She was the regional director of hospital operations for the network that owned Cascade Ridge, and she had the specific purposeful quality of someone sent in to assess damage and make decisions. She met with the senior clinical staff, the department heads, the remaining administrative personnel. She spent 2 hours with Ferris and one of the IG investigators. And then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she asked to meet with Nora. They sat in the director's office, which already felt different without Callahan in it, cleaner somehow, less weighted. "I've spent 3 days reviewing everything," Solberg said. She was direct in the way of people who'd done enough difficult things to have stopped finding the direct path uncomfortable. "The clinical record, the IG documentation, the personnel files, the inventory audit, all of it." She paused. "I want to ask you something, and I want your honest answer." "Okay." "The nursing staff on your unit, not just your floor, the full clinical staff, roughly 30% of them have come to me in the last 3 days. Voluntarily, without being asked. They wanted to describe what they'd observed about the previous leadership structure, about what it looked like when it was working the way it was designed to work, and what it looked like when someone tried to push back against it." Solberg held her gaze. "Every single one of them mentioned your name, not as part of the problem, as the person who made them feel like the work still meant something even when the structure around it was broken." Nora didn't say anything. "I'm going to be restructuring the clinical leadership here," Solberg said. "The charge nurse positions, the floor supervisory roles. I need someone who understands this staff, this patient population, and the specific way this unit functions under pressure." She paused. "I'm not offering you a charge nurse position. Those are coordinator roles. I'm creating a clinical operations lead position. It doesn't exist yet. I'm designing it now, with responsibility for cross-unit standards, clinical protocol oversight, and direct advisory access to network leadership on patient care policy." She held Nora's gaze. "I'm offering it to you." Nora sat with that. The honest answer to what Solberg was offering was complicated. She was a nurse. She'd chosen that specifically, had walked away from a military career that would have taken her up a command ladder, and chosen instead to be the person in the room with the patient, the person whose job was the immediate and particular work of keeping someone alive. The thing she was being offered was larger than that, further from the bedside, more administrative than clinical. "I'd need to stay in direct patient care," she said. "Whatever the role looks like, I need a clinical component, actual floor hours, not oversight of care, delivery of it." Solberg nodded. "I can build that in. And the protocols I develop, combat medicine integration, field pathogen recognition, the dual pathway framework, I want those implemented network-wide, not just here." "That's already in the scope, I'm imagining." Nora looked at the desk. At the empty space where Callahan's framed credentials had been, the rectangles of slightly different paint where they'd hung for years. "I'll need 2 weeks to think about it," she said. "You have them." She was in the ICU that evening, the end of her shift, doing a final check on Cross's lines, when he said, "You look like someone who made a complicated decision today." "I look like someone who's been working for 12 hours. "You look like both." He was sitting up more fully than he'd managed since his arrival, the drainage tube removed that afternoon, his color approaching something that could be called normal. He still had the ICU rhythm about him, the particular patience of someone who'd learned to exist in a limited space. But the quality underneath it was different, more present, more like the person he must be outside of this. "Solberg offered me a position," she said. "Forsyth told me." "Forsyth told you?" "He tells me things." A pause. "What are you going to do?" She finished checking the IV line and stood straight. "I'm going to take it, probably. I haven't decided the details yet." He nodded. "It means staying here," she said, "in Harbor Crest, in this building. Is that a problem?" She thought about it honestly. The question wasn't whether she could stay in a building where she'd been treated the way she'd been treated for 2 years. She'd been in harder places. The question was whether staying was choosing to build something or choosing to prove something, and those were different motivations with different results, and she wanted to be clear with herself about which one was operating. "No," she said, and found that it was true. "Good." He looked at the window. "I'm going to be transferred to a military medical facility in about a week for the cardiac work. They have a specialist there who knows the specific damage profile." He paused. "It's in Seattle. That's 3 hours from here." "Yes." A beat. "When I'm through rehab, I'm planning to run a transition support program for special operations personnel coming out of active duty. There's a significant gap in what's available. The medical side is covered, mostly, but the operational decompression, the identity restructuring, finding civilian purpose without losing what the service built in you." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I have the backing to do it. I just need the right advisory structure." He looked at her. "I'm going to ask if you'd be willing to be part of that. Not now. In 6 months, a year, when the program has its shape. Part-time, advisory, your specific experience with the transition, with maintaining clinical identity across military and civilian contexts." She looked at him. "You've been planning this for a while," she said. "I've had time to think." "You're thorough," she said, which was what she'd said the first time he told her that, and he recognized it, and the corner of his mouth moved. "The people on that mountain with me," he said, "the ones who came back, 4 of them had significant transition difficulties. 2 left careers they were built for because there was no structure to hold them through the adjustment. One of them," he stopped, "one of them didn't make it through at all." He looked at his hands. "I can't build the time machine, but I can build the structure that wasn't there." There were things she could say to that. She didn't say most of them. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." The commendation ceremony was 33 days later, on a clear October morning at a military installation 40 miles outside Harbor Crest. It was not small. Nora had requested something modest. Forsyth had conveyed this request to the relevant command with what she suspected was selective emphasis, because what arrived was modest only in comparison to what it could have been. About 60 people, a mix of military personnel and the surviving members of the operation from 3 years ago, several of whom she was seeing for the first time with their names attached to their faces. There were no cameras from outside the installation. There was no press. There was a citation read aloud in full, which was the first time she'd heard the official account of that night spoken by someone other than Forsyth in a hospital hallway. And it was a strange experience, like hearing a piece of music you'd written described by someone who understood its structure better than you'd understood it when you were writing it. Priya came. Nora hadn't asked her to. She'd mentioned the date obliquely, and Priya had said she had the day free and would like to come if that was acceptable, and Nora had said it was. She stood near the back in civilian clothes, looking slightly overwhelmed and slightly angry in the specific way she got when things moved her, and she didn't want to show it. Vasquez came. That one had surprised Nora more. Vasquez had called her 2 days before, and asked with characteristic directness whether it would be appropriate for her to attend, and Nora had said yes before she'd finished the question. Rosaria came. She drove herself and arrived 10 minutes early and stood with the specific quiet of someone who'd spent 30 years around people in extremity and had developed a deep comfort with witnessing. Cross was there in a wheelchair, his chest still healing, the cardiac specialist's instructions apparently including a prohibition on standing at ceremonies for longer than 5 minutes. He stood anyway when Nora walked forward to receive the commendation. Forsyth gave him a look. He sat back down after about 3 minutes, which was a compromise. The commendation was a physical thing, formal, documented, the kind of object that had weight in both the literal and procedural sense. Forsyth handed it to her and shook her hand and said something quiet that she heard clearly and will keep. The assembled personnel came to attention. The sound of that, 60 people moving into stillness simultaneously, the specific quality of that collective acknowledgement, was something she hadn't prepared for, and she stood in it for a moment and let it be what it was. She wasn't the person who needed ceremonies. She'd built a whole life on not being that person. But she was standing in this one, and it was reaching her in places she'd thought were past reaching, because the thing being acknowledged wasn't a performance or a display. It was something real that had happened in the dark, that she'd spent 3 years carrying alone, and the acknowledgement wasn't praise exactly. It was recognition. They are different things, and the difference matters more than most people understand. After, people came to speak to her one by one, and she let them, and she listened to what they said with the full attention of someone who understood that these conversations were their own kind of completion. 3 of the operators from that night told her things she'd never known, what had happened after she'd reached the extraction point, how it had ended, who had survived the subsequent months, and who hadn't. She absorbed all of it. One of them, a quiet man in his 40s named Briggs, who walked with a slight favor to his left leg that the Afghan terrain had apparently given him permanently, held her hand between both of his for a moment and didn't say anything. That was its own thing, and she held it the same way she held the others. Cross found her afterward when the formal part was done and people were dispersing toward cars and the particular low-key socializing of people who didn't quite know what came after a thing like this. He'd traded the wheelchair for 2 forearm crutches against the specialist's wishes she suspected, and he looked like someone moving through discomfort on willpower and the refusal to be seated while everyone else was standing. "You should sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're functional, which isn't the same thing." Noted. He stood beside her looking at the hills beyond the installation fence. The October light was the particular clear gold of the northwest coast in autumn, everything sharp-edged and specific. "How do you feel?" She thought about the question. She'd been thinking about it since the citation was read, since she'd stood in the collective stillness of 60 people and felt something shift that she'd been waiting to shift for a long time. "Like something got put back," she said. "I know that sounds... I don't mean it was missing, exactly. I made the choice to leave. I set things down deliberately. But there's a version of yourself that exists in the record of what you've done, and when that record is locked away somewhere nobody can see it, you carry the weight of it without anyone else knowing what you're carrying." She paused. "It's lighter now. That's the most accurate thing I can say." He nodded. He looked at the hills. "My father knew," she said. "Yes. He knew and he couldn't tell me, and I spent 12 years thinking he was a quiet man who worked for a contractor and had nothing remarkable in him." She let out a slow breath. "He had everything remarkable in him. He just carried it the same way I was carrying mine." "It runs in families," Cross said. "Apparently." They stood together in the October light for a moment, not particularly close, not particularly distant, 2 people who had arrived at the same day from very different directions and found it meant more than either of them had permitted themselves to fully anticipate. "Seattle," she said. 6 months? Give or take. I'll look at what you're building when you have the shape of it. That's all I'm asking." But she was back at Cascade Ridge the following Monday. The director's office had a new occupant. Solberg had appointed an interim director from within the network while the permanent search was conducted. And the floor had the specific changed quality of spaces where institutional upheaval has recently settled. Some things were different. Some things were exactly the same, which was its own kind of information about the difference between leadership change and cultural change, and Nora filed it as something to attend to in the role she was moving into. She started her shift the way she always started it, checked in with the outgoing nurse, reviewed the board, identified which patients needed the most immediate attention. There was a post-surgical patient in Bay 4 with a recovery complication, a pediatric case in Bay 6 that required a consult she'd already arranged, an elderly man in Bay 2 who had come in overnight and was medically stable but frightened and alone, which was its own kind of emergency that the clinical record didn't fully capture. She went to Bay 2 first. He was in his 80s, small, a farmer from outside Harbor Crest, who'd been brought in by a neighbor after a fall, and who had the specific bewildered quality of someone encountering the institutional machinery of a large hospital for the first time at an age when it was most frightening. He looked at Nora when she came in with the wariness of someone who'd been processed by strangers all night, and didn't know how many more strangers were coming. "Mr. Tanaka," she said, "I'm Nora. I'm going to be your nurse today." He looked at her for a moment. "Just today?" "For now. We'll see." She pulled up his chart, checked the overnight notes, looked at his vitals, did all of the things that needed doing, and did them with the full attention of someone who understood that the work in this room was the center of everything that had happened in the last 2 weeks. Not the commendation, not the investigation, not the record unsealed and the recognition finally given, but this. An old man alone in a hospital room, frightened, needing someone to be present with him. This was what it was all for. "Your hip looks good," she said. "The imaging from last night was clean. That means we can talk about getting you home sooner than you might think." He relaxed slightly. "I have a dog," he said. "She'll be worried." "What's her name?" "Ruthie." "Then we'll work fast," she said. Here is what I know to be true, watching a story like Nora's from the outside, and knowing that some version of it plays out in real buildings, in real hallways, every day. The people who dismiss others rarely believe they're doing it. They have explanations. She's overstepping. He doesn't understand the culture here. That's not how we do things. The dismissal is always dressed in process, in protocol, in the language of institutional necessity. It's almost never called what it is, which is fear. The specific fear of people who have built their authority on other people's silence, confronting someone who has not learned to be silent in the ways that convenience them. And the people who are dismissed rarely announce what they're carrying. That's part of the dismissal working. The weight you carry alone is the weight nobody can see. An invisible weight looks like nothing, and nothing looks like you have nothing to offer. Nora worked 2 years in a building that had decided she was nothing, and she came in every shift and she did her work, and she carried 3 years of a classified mountain in Afghanistan and a father's unclaimed legacy and the specific knowledge that what she knew could save lives, and she carried all of it quietly, the way her father had taught her by example, without ever being able to tell her that was what he was teaching. That's the thing about quiet strength. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be seen. It just keeps showing up, keeps doing the work, keeps being precisely itself in rooms that keep trying to reduce it to something smaller. And it accumulates. Quietly, invisibly, relentlessly, it accumulates. Until one night a helicopter hits a rooftop in a storm and a man says a name, and everything that was invisible becomes the only thing in the room. They tried to reduce her to just a nurse, and what she turned out to be was the person who carried their best operator out of a firefight and then walked into a civilian hospital and kept him alive twice more. And the thing that made all of it possible was the same thing they'd been trying to punish her for. The refusal to stay in a lane that was smaller than what she knew. She never stopped being a nurse. That wasn't the revelation. The revelation was that just a nurse was never a small thing to begin with, and the people who treated it that way had been wrong from the start. The bullies lost their positions and their authority, and will face the institutional and legal consequences of what they built. And those consequences are specific and documented and ongoing. Nora Whitaker went back to work on a Maupin Day morning in October with a commendation in her desk drawer and a new role taking shape around her and an old man's frightened dog waiting at home. And she started her shift the way she always started it, by finding the person who needed the most from her and going there first. That is what it looks like when someone gets their record back. Not the ceremony, not the citation, not the collapse of the people who tried to take it from them. It looks like Monday. It looks like showing up. It looks like all the work still waiting to be done.